Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. For this episode, I had the opportunity to sit down with Maria Alberto. Maria is a 4th-year PhD student at the University of Utah, and her research focuses on adaptation and fan studies. I was really excited to be able to sit down with Maria today because she and her colleague Dawn Walls-Thumma recently launched the Tolkien Fanfiction Survey. I'll be sure to put a link to this survey in our show notes for anyone who's interested in participating, and I'm sure she'll give us more information about the survey at the end of our interview, but for now, please just listen and enjoy her Tolkien experience. So, Maria, would you mind sharing with us how you were first introduced to Tolkien's work?
Yeah, definitely. I actually came to Tolkien's work fairly late compared to some other people in the community who I've definitely heard saying they were kids, right? They were reading this when they were 6, 7, 8, and so on. Growing up, I was an extremely avid reader, but there were certain rules in the household about what we were or weren't allowed to read, and books were always kind of labeled as quote-unquote age-appropriate. Fantasy or really literature that dealt with heavy themes and entailed a lot of magic definitely went into that category. So I was about 15 when I read The Lord of the Rings for the first time. And embarrassingly, I can't recall if I'd read The Hobbit before that. So anyway, a teenager, and once I'd read The Lord of the Rings, that was it for me. I was interested in Middle-earth for life. I just chugged right through those 3 books and loved them so much that I immediately went looking for more, which means that I also encountered the Silmarillion at around the same time. But that particular venture into Middle-earth was actually quite a turnoff at the time because, as experienced readers and experienced listeners no doubt know, the Silmarillion is really another animal. Mythic prehistory is the term that I've kind of seen batted around as compared to the epic of The Lord of the Rings and then, the fairy story of The Hobbit. So moving from The Lord of the Rings into the Silmarillion was just a step too far when I was a teenager. But that was the point at which I really first encountered Middle-earth and never quite recovered for that. Something else that I find really interesting when I look back from my vantage point now is that even though I was reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time in around 2007, 2008, I was still what Kristen Thompson and some other Tolkien scholars call book firsters. That is, I'd actually never seen the movies before reading the books, even though they'd already been released for a couple of years by that point. And in fact, I had to hound one of my younger brothers to hurry up and finish reading the books with me so that, our parents would then let us watch the movies. This is just because with 6 kids, my parents wouldn't do things that didn't serve at least 2 of us at a time. And the other really big part of my experience with Tolkien's work from the very beginning is that I considered myself a fan and I wanted to write about it. Actually, I think the year after I read The Lord of the Rings, I actually submitted a poem about Legolas's sea longing to one of the fanzines that was still around at the time. And somewhere in my apartment, I probably still have a copy of the issue where they published it, right? I got a little bound fanzine. It was very cool. And yet, between one thing and another, I didn't really dive into online Tolkien fandom and online Tolkien fanfiction until really relatively recently, I think 2016. But once I got into that, and once I started writing about Tolkien's work in a really scholarly light, I just haven't stopped since then. It's been around.
Well, that's wonderful. So a whole lot to unpack in that story. That's just so interesting. So I really think it's fascinating that, even with the movies having been out for a while, you were still introduced to the books first. Did you kind of have, an awareness of the Lord of the Rings in culture before you sat down to read the books?
I think I didn't really. And I was actually homeschooled up until I attended college, so I was mainly seeing what was around the house. So if my parents didn't have it on our shelves or we didn't pick it up at the library, then I wasn't really that exposed to it. And
Mm-hmm.
that meant that, as movies were being released, as movies were in theaters, I wasn't aware of them. So it was a complete shock to go from having read the novels like earlier that year and then going to watch all three Jackson movies one after another after another. It was just concentrated awesome all at once.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be quite an experience. Um, my first reading was very similar in that I was a little younger. I was around 11, um, but it was shortly before the movies came out. But I had no knowledge whatsoever that a movie was coming, um, and so it was very much like this thing that I could kind of create my own meaning out of for a little while, um, and then start seeing all the other stuff and deciding how it measured up to my interpretation.
Very,
Uh,
very much so. And on the one hand, I'm quite grateful that kind of as you said, I was able to form my own mental picture of Middle Earth and what the characters looked like and how they spoke and how they sounded before I encountered the Jackson versions. But on the other hand, I think it would have been really neat to have been in an active part of the fandom online at that point because not only are the Jackson films really interesting cinematic artifacts in their own light, but actually the first trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is really an exemplar of blockbuster marketing, of reaching out, of the producers reaching out to the fans and trying
mhm.
to not quite at the level of co-create, but definitely be in dialogue with an existing audience in a way that really hadn't been done in films before. We see this so often nowadays, right? With producer teams and directors and studios putting out all of these paratextual materials, the making of interviews, cast. We don't really sometimes think about how much of that Jackson and his team started because not only were they putting together this epic set of three films, but they were going for a real culturally important piece of literature. And they're like, we
Mhm.
have to do this justice. Even if people aren't happy, we have to show people we're listening to them. So I think it would have been really neat to kind of be in that moment as well. I kind of regret I wasn't there for that.
Yeah, we were fortunate in that we had uh, I just blanked. Clifford Broadway, also known as Quick Beam, came on for an interview, and he's a
Mhm.
part of that whole the OneRing.net group.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it was really fascinating hearing some of his stories around that time about, they threw the cast party for the movie release and those kinds of things. It's just like that is a remarkable thing for, like you're saying, this adaptation to take it so seriously to engage
Yeah.
with the fandom that's already there.
Right. I think it was very smart of them to realize that they weren't only aiming for fidelity to Tolkien's works, they were aiming at kind of converting a lot of an existing fandom for these books into being okay with the idea that there was going to be a filmic adaptation, and that
Hmm.
by the filmic adaptation existing, then that would bring in people who had never read Tolkien's work but were all of a sudden having access to Middle Earth. So it's a kind of a thorny, complicated issue. And I really am impressed with Jackson and his team for acknowledging that and going right for that with the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Hmm. Okay, so to get us back to your experience, because
Oh,
I
yeah,
really am
right.
fascinated in it. um, so through your different experiences, reading The Lord of the Rings and then watching the movies and attempting the Silmarillion, is there a fondest experience that you've had of Tolkien's work throughout the years?
Oh my goodness. That is a difficult question to answer because there are so many fond ones that it's hard to pick the one that is fondest. I also should preface this by saying that eventually I was completely converted to the Silmarillion, and honestly, that's where most of my work these days is done. So
Hmm.
not to leave that on a complete cliffhanger. But in terms of, say, fondness stemming from joy, I definitely have to say that my first time reading The Lord of the Rings and just devouring it, just plowing through it, and then getting to the very end where Frodo sees the white shores of the West, you can't really beat or replicate that kind of sheer, oh my God, kind of moment, especially if you've never read anything like this book before. But runners up would definitely have to include buying my very own first copy of The Lord of the Rings. That was the first book that I ever bought with money I'd earned. In addition, my first ever conference paper as a baby academic first year MA student, I actually gave that talk about the ramifications of Legolas taking Gimli into the West. So it got me kind of hooked into this form of specialized public speaking, and it feels very apt that I was doing that by sharing my love of Tolkien stories. I also was at Oxenmoot 2015, which is the annual gathering of the Tolkien Society, and it was the largest in-person gathering of Tolkien fans that I had ever witnessed, and honestly probably still have witnessed. The sheer energy and the joy that weren't being partitioned among Tolkien and other popular culture sources, that was just really amazing. And then not quite fond in terms of joy, but definitely fond in thinking of meaningful. I would have to say that was like visiting Tolkien's grave for the first time, which I did during a semester abroad in the UK in 2013. So I was actually studying in northern England, but I made the trip south and I went and I stood there and I was feeling a bit foolish. I was like, okay, because there's a road right nearby. You can hear like mowers, you can hear people walking by. And so it's just that kind of contrast between where I was and what it meant to me, and then, the outside world just right outside. But at the time, I'd like left him a letter saying, thank you for, giving the world this secondary world that means so much to all of us. So yeah, lots of choices, lots of different ways that I could answer that question, honestly.
Yeah, that memory of going to the grave just sounds so beautiful. Um, and it's funny that you contrast it with kind of what was going on the outside, because to me it instantly struck me as, but isn't that always what our experience is with Tolkien? Like, we're in the book submerged in this world, but then as soon as we set the book down, there's a completely different world that's been going on the whole time.
Right, right. And although, something like that could be said of picking up and putting down any book, I think it's especially striking when that is so much of Tolkien's project in the first place, right? That he is setting up this secondary world that he wants us to kind of move to and from our primary world from. So when he succeeds in doing that, as he so often does, it's just very striking. Like, I knew he was trying to do that. I knew he was attempting to do that, and he really succeeded.
Yeah. So, speaking of this secondary world that we love,
Hmm.
what is your favorite part of Tolkien's work?
Ooh, okay. Another one that has probably multiple answers. I'll stick to just two. On a structural level, I really love and I really appreciate the myth building aspect of Tolkien's work, which is why once I finally wrapped my head around, the Silmarillion being in a different genre than the Lord of the Rings, I just dove in and really loved it. I really enjoy the way in which Tolkien sets up the various texts, what we as readers now encounter as separate books for the most part. But the way he sets them up as different layers, if you will, of this really grand, overarching narrative with its own mythos, but that also is its own mythos. In other words, what we encounter in, say, the Silmarillion, with its kind of temporally distant tone of a story that's being told from the deep, deep past, what's really neat about that is that's the way that characters of the Third Age are encountering it as well when they hear snippets of the story of Beren and Luthien, or Frodo is gifted part of the light of Eärendil. Like, those are big, neat names to the characters of the Third Age, but they aren't really close. They aren't really something they can or ever have encountered for the most part. So I love that structural element. I just can't get enough of that. Keep going back to the Silmarillion for that. On a more narrative level, though, I really love the first stage city of Nargothrond and its people, its stories, its place in the overall history of that time period when the continent of Beleriand was half sunk and, or before it was sunk, and then Middle-earth was left. This city just intrigues me for a number of reasons. One is that it was founded by one of the most politically and economically savvy princes of the Noldor, Finrod Felagund, who, unlike a lot of his kinsmen, we see him on good terms with all of the different races and the people around him. Like, he's on good terms with the dwarves. He works with them to build this city. The other elves who had never gone into the West, who'd remained in Beleriand, like, he actually goes out and makes alliances with them. He helps them with their own fortifications, their own cities, and he, expands his city into this entire kingdom. And even men or humans who were actually shown that he's the elf who makes first contact, if you will, with the race of humans in the Silmarillion. So you have that really fascinating kind of history behind it with even the founder figure. There's also the way in which Nargothrond gives us these fascinating glimpses of other characters, even when they're not in the foreground. So, for instance, we see a character named Edrahil, who is some citizen or soldier who follows Finrod to his death when they go on the quest with Beren for Silmaril. And it's really interesting because we have that kind of loyalty, but we only see that character's name twice. There's never really anything more about them, so we can kind of place him in Nargothrond, but we can't really do much more. This is also where we meet a young Celebrimbor for the first time, long before he creates the Three Rings, and we see him here repudiating like the deeds and the kinship of his father when they turn against Finrod. We also see Gwyndor, who is one of the few elves ever stricken by age and disability in this really explicit way. Findulias, one of the few named women who also gets lines and screen time. And then, of course, Turin Turambar, who, with and around this city, we just see some of his more disastrous political and leadership decisions. So it's like a setting for all of that. It's a place where we actually are able to get a sense of the longevity of elves and the complexity of this age, because all of those different people are in this one city at one point or another. So that really fascinates me. It's not closed like Gondolin, and you have this kind of people moving back and forth. And as if you need like any more cool stuff about Nargothrond, that city actually stands at the periphery of two of the three great tales, right? So it plays its part in the story of Turin Turambar, and it plays its part in the story of Beren and Luthien. And it actually enables these stories to be told in a way by providing them with a setting that we don't need to examine in too much detail in order to accept that it's there. And things can happen, the myth can progress without specifying, okay, so here's where they stopped, and we just say Nargothrond, and we have kind of this image of this city with these resources, these characters, these people all available, and so saying the name kind of invokes all of that other messy stuff that we don't want to hear about in the myth. So, Nargothrond. Definitely Nargothrond.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating insight that you've shared about Nargothrond. It reminds me of, we have, before I pivoted to Tolkien, I dealt much more with earlier texts. And, we have this whole wealth of literature and stories and things about, Arthur and Camelot. But oftentimes Camelot is used in that same way. It's like, okay, let's say Camelot, and everyone automatically makes all the assumptions about who's there, what the relationships are. And so we can make up these different characters like Gawain, and we can just say, okay, we're going to follow Gawain from here to there and plug him into Camelot at some point, and then it just automatically fills out the rest of the world for the audience. You don't have to add all that extra detail.
Yeah, yeah. So by saying that he went to Camelot, for instance, we can assume that he made contact with the other great heroes of the age. He accessed resources, treasures, and magic. Just exactly a shorthand version for any of that might come up later in the story. Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, now we have to write a paper together.
Funny you should say that. I plug at the end, but yes.
So to come back to some of the questions before I dogtail us too much. It sounds like you've had a lot of great interactions and a real breadth of interactions with Tolkien's work. Would you say that your overall approach to his work has changed over time?
Ooh, I would say that it has. One thing that hasn't changed is my love of sharing Tolkien's work. But what has changed is kind of the means. At one point early on, it felt like my only recourse was to pick up, my trilogy and shake it at someone, or to like pitch one of Jackson's trilogies, right? But today I feel like I have a much better critical vocabulary and a much better way of explaining how Tolkien impacted what we see fantasy as a genre, if people, stick around to listen to that whole soapbox, of course. So I just have better ways of kind of framing and explaining why Tolkien. In terms of one of my other favorite activities, fan fiction, though, I feel like I approach Tolkien's work a lot more freely than I used to when I began writing. At some point, I guess I had internalized that I had to stick with characters and characterizations as these are set forth in Tolkien's canon. It's a pretty common approach, I think, especially because we have such a capacious canon. Like, you can find details about anything if you dig, deep enough. But since then, I've really started realizing about how the same gaps or missing areas or underdeveloped or outright, unnamed characters and cultures that we see, particularly in the Silmarillion, as it's written from kind of that distant, surface level tone. Like, that's part of the project, but it can be really frustrating to encounter that as a reader. But digging into those can be just as rewarding as writing about the things that we do know more about from the canon.
Yeah, so this is the first time that you've mentioned fan fiction, and it reminds me back to someone you work with very closely, Dawn Walls-Thumma. In her interview with us, she talked about how fan fiction was kind of a way that she started engaging with the fandom more than just as kind of a standalone fan. How did the two of you meet through fan fiction, or did you meet through your interest in fan studies, or did something else bring the two of you together to start working together?
So a little bit of both, actually. We did initially meet through fan fiction. I forget if it was specifically through Dawn's organization, which is the Silmarillion Writers Guild, or SWG. It might also have been in another fan gathering space. We were moving among like 3 different ones at the time. But we also started talking further when we realized that not only were we both fan fiction authors, but we were also both trying to study Tolkien's work and fan fiction of Tolkien's work in these more formal academic ways. So then we started talking about that, and we actually connected at a popular culture conference a couple years back. Once we had done that, we kind of compared approaches, what we were doing, our interests, and we started talking about co-authoring and co-writing projects like pretty much immediately afterwards. So again, a little bit of both with Dawn and I.
Yeah, I find that to be very interesting how with so many there are varying names for this kind of thing. People who are both fans and scholars, some call themselves like ACA-fans, some call themselves like fan scholars, those kinds of things. But I feel like perhaps, I'm not going to make it a definitive statement, but perhaps more in this kind of subset of scholars than in others, there's this drive to really have a more kind of communal scholarship, to where like you're authoring things together, and the things that you produce you want to make available in a lot of different formats so people can access it easier, and the drive to kind of keep knowledge in kind of a shared community.
Yes, very much so. And it's exciting to hear you kind of identify that and point that out as a defining feature of fan study scholarship, because, yes, if we're doing it right, then that is absolutely what fan studies work should be. And I think that there are a number of reasons for this. One is certainly that those who move into fan studies and become fan studies scholars tend to be pre-existing fans of whatever they then go on to specialize and write about. So this is not to say that's not true for those who write about more canonical works. So someone who studies Shakespeare probably in part they enjoy Shakespeare, right? Um, but with fan studies scholars, I feel like there's a little bit more of an effective connection to the text they're studying and to the community of fans who don't necessarily make that leap over into scholarship. So it feels like honoring that kind of relationship with both the text you love and the community that you love it alongside. There's also, I think, the element of with fan studies, so much of, not all, but so much of fan work actually does share interesting similarities with what we would consider academic work. For instance, the type of example that comes immediately to mind is a type of essay called a meta, or metatextual. A meta will dig into the small given details from a canon text and will examine them, draw out their implications, and explain them for other fans to build upon. That's very similar to academic close reading, right? So a lot of the practices between fan studies scholarship and fan studies work are already quite similar. So you have that kind of effective connection to the source of the community, and then you have oftentimes that pre-existing what's the word I'm looking for? That pre-existing experience with something that already very closely approaches academic work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So heading on into our last question here,
Mm-hmm.
would you ever recommend Tolkien's work to someone else, and why or why not?
Ooh, okay. I would, and I certainly have. Going along with the previous question, though, of, has the way you approach Tolkien's work changed over time? I think that similarly, the way that I recommend Tolkien's work has also changed over time. And a lot of it has to do with the cultural conversation around Tolkien changing as well. For instance, you mentioned Tolkien, and people will kind of like Nargothrond earlier. We mentioned the name, and it shorthands a whole bunch of stuff. You mentioned Tolkien's name, and it shorthands a whole bunch of stuff. Obviously, of course, Jackson's films. Sometimes, unfortunately, conversations about whether Tolkien echoing the kind of some of the beliefs of his times was racist, whether and why he focused solely on white characters, or we can assume that. And so these are all really good and important conversations to have. But if that's what people immediately think of when I mention Tolkien, right, they might not go into his work ready to appreciate and to love it. They might, need a little easing into it. There's also the way in which, if you approach Tolkien's Lord of the Rings specifically, after having read a lot more of the fantasy that has followed it, it can be like, wait a second, this feels really obvious, this feels really overdone, and you're like, no, 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 this preceded everything else. This set our foundations for everything else. But again, I feel like without having some of that kind of conversation first, it can set sometimes new readers up for disappointment when they really don't have to be. So, to put all this another way, yes, I totally recommend Tolkien's work, but I do so carefully and selectively, so I know that there's a good chance those I'm recommending it to will actually read it, finish it, and enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that to to go back to the interview with your colleague Don Walls-Thumma, we talked about a very similar thing about, how much a work means to us as readers really depends on kind of the point we are in our life when we read that book. And so it sounds like you're really getting to the same thing, that, it's you're recommending them to the people that you think are at that point where it will have that meaning for them.
Correct. Instead of assuming that everyone will fall into Middle Earth and love it as much as I did, right? Because I'm like, that's not really a productive assumption to make at any point, but particularly about a text that, sometimes people do find difficult to get into and to stick with.
Mm-hmm. Great. So the last question I want to ask you today is, are you currently working on anything that our listeners can get involved with or participate in?
Oh, definitely. So the most important thing that I should mention is that Dawn and I have just launched a second iteration of the Tolkien Fanfiction Survey, which is a survey that she had initially released in 2014. And we're just trying to reach people who've ever read or ever written fan fiction that draws on Tolkien and draws on Middle-earth in any way, shape, or form. So there's no prerequisites of you have to have read this many books or watched this many movies. Nope. If you've ever read or you've ever written fan fiction that draws from Tolkien in any way, we would love for you to take this survey. And the purpose of this survey is there are a couple. It's multi-purpose. First of all, Dawn initially put this together because she was noticing that she was trying to get a kind of screenshot of the moment following the release of the Hobbit trilogy, basically. So we had another new wave of fans who, some of them have not watched either Jackson's original trilogy or who had not read the canon text from Tolkien, but were coming to Tolkien fandom solely through The Hobbit. So she was really interested in seeing how their relationship with fan fiction was different from folks who had come in through both or through either of those other options. And she's been trying to make sure that this survey is longitudinal, or it's, looking at a length of time. And so this is now 5 years later after that survey closed in 2015. So we're just trying to see, now that there is no major release because the Amazon series is still in production, so what are the prevailing attitudes, beliefs, motivations, what have you, for people who are reading and writing Tolkien fan fiction?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I should make note that I will definitely be putting a link to that survey in the show notes. So anywhere that listeners are hearing this, there should be a link available to them somewhere so they can participate.
Fantastic, because the more people who take it, the merrier. We want to have hopefully more people even than we reached last time. So again, the more people who take this, the happier we'll be.
I did have a question for clarification purposes. So let's pretend, say, that there was a humble podcast host who, as an intrepid middle schooler, decided that they were going to write their own fantasy. And it was not consciously fan fiction, but in the rereading, it was discovered that it was fan fiction. Does that count for your study?
I would highly encourage this hypothetical humble podcaster to take the survey, definitely. I would caution this hypothetical podcaster that some of the questions do really dig into the minutia, and you're, well, again, hypothetical. The hypothetical podcaster would be welcome to answer those questions in as much or as little detail as they deemed appropriate. Again, this is more to just kind of get a sense of where the fandom at large is at regarding fan fiction. But yes, I would absolutely recommend that.
Okay, excellent. The only other thing I wanted to say was that I said it when Dawn was on earlier, but I also want to say it when you're on. The kind of work that you're doing is so helpful to so many scholars because it provides a data set. And that's something that I get the sense that not a lot of fans and scholars really understand how much work that takes.
So much work. So much work.
And so I just kind of wanted to say thank you for doing that work, because it's the kind of thing that other scholars can really build on in the future.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you so much. I mean, it has taken us a literal year at this point to put it together and get it through IRB at the University of Utah, but already it's been available for 6 days at this point, and just the amount of interest we've seen and the rate of response. So it's really great to see that effort acknowledged and put to good use, both from yourself and from those who have taken the survey. So we really appreciate that as well.
Well, I want to thank you again so much for joining me today. It's been really wonderful hearing about your Tolkien experience.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favorite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronL.Palmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.